So, people interested in the issue of biodiversity offsets, they're generally familiar with offset requirements that are spelled out in the European Habitats Directive of 1992, and especially with the Articles 6.3 and 6.4 that spell out how impacts on the Natura 2000 network of protected areas can be authorized if they're appropriately offset. But in general, people, I think, are less familiar with another set of articles, Articles 12 and 16 of the Habitats Directive. Under those articles, impacting protected species of plants and animals, those that are listed in Annex 4 of the directive, is only possible if the impacting project is justified by reasons of overriding public interest, that no alternatives exist to the project, and that allowing the impacts doesn't preclude the reaching or maintaining of what's called a favorable conservation status for the impacted species. And so in its 2007 guidance, the European Commission states that the net result of granting a derogation to the strict protection of species should be neutral or positive for the species. Now for me, maintaining a favorable conservation status for the impacted species sounds a lot like no net loss, as I understand it anyway. And so I think this is really interesting, and the guidance actually suggests that offsets are a way of achieving this goal of no net loss. What the guidance says is that even though compensation measures, that's what they're called, are not mentioned in Article 16, and as such they're not obligatory, they can be envisaged in the case of deterioration or destruction of breeding sites and resting places. And if you use that, then the offsets have, the compensation measures have to offset the negative impacts of the activity. They have to have a good chance of success and be based on best practice. They have to guarantee the species prospects of achieving this favorable conservation status. And they have to be effective before or at the latest when deterioration or destruction of a breeding site or resting place starts to take place. This is what the guidance actually says. So this is EU law, right? But that's actually not enough, because to be applied on the ground, all of this has to be transposed into national laws, and this is where things really matter. And so in France, this Article 16 of the Habitats Directive, which dates back to 1992, was actually only transposed in 2007. So until then, until 2007, there was actually no procedure, no legal way in France for allowing impacts on a species, on a protected species, except for scientific purposes. That was the only reason you could have. And what I find sort of funny is that the actual motivation for introducing this derogation regime from the Habitats Directive into French law was to allow government shooting of wolves. Wolves are a protected species, and they recolonized the French Alps in the 1990s, coming in from Italy. And that, at the time, and actually still now, generates a lot of conflict with the livestock industry. And so, with no harm to the species allowed, the government was sort of stuck. So they introduced this derogation procedure to be able to grant exemptions to the strict protection of species. And this works as long as the exemption doesn't cause a degradation of the conservation status of the species. And in the way the procedure is set up in France, to assess that, to assess the fact that there is no degradation, the environmental authorities, they have to consult with a national nature conservation committee at the national level. And today this committee plays a very central role in the whole system and in generating offsets from granting those derogations. So in fact, the wolf sort of got out of the picture, and this derogation procedure has actually had a lot of important consequences, especially for large infrastructure projects. And this is how the whole discussion on offsets got going in France, so starting in 2007, around then. And it's also in that context that the issue of conservation banking emerged. So 2007 was very important. And the new procedure really challenged the people involved, the developers, of course, the consultants who work for them, the regulators, and the environmental NGOs who were putting a lot of pressure on the system. And no one really knew what to do. So what happened is that the National Nature Conservation Committee began to ask developers to size their offset requirements using area-based ratios. And basically these ratios, they reflect how rare or endangered a species is, sometimes also how emblematic they are. And they would range between 1 to 1, so in area, to ratios of 10 to 1, basically. But with no set rules for this. And so the way you proceed is that you have an area of habitat for a species that is impacted by a project, and you multiply that area by the ratio, and that tells you how much offset you have to do. But unfortunately, the discussion usually stops there. And so what happens is the developers purchase that area that was calculated, usually an area of high quality habitat for the target species, and then they hand that over to a local conservation NGO, who's usually really happy to find a way to access this land and preserve it. But this is really hardly good enough because it leads, of course, to a net loss of habitat. And so in that sense, it doesn't live up to the expectations of the Habitats Directive, from which all of this comes from. And then there's another issue, is that focusing the discussion on setting area requirements actually overlooks the actual feasibility of that requirement. And too often, developers got away with just saying that what was required was actually impossible, and that they couldn't do it. And so what happened, and this is the other important date in all of this, is that in 2012 this changed. And it changed because the environmental impact assessment regulations were strengthened in 2012. The measures that are aimed at avoiding, reducing, and offsetting impacts of development projects now have to be included in the permit itself, together with descriptions of how success and failure will be monitored and reported. So what this means, actually, is that until 2012, a lot of promises that were made in impact assessment documents never actually got into the actual permits. But these permits are actually the only legally binding documents. I don't know, I found that pretty surprising when I found that out. But so this changed in June 2012, and so now developers are actually liable for their offsets, and offsets become performance-based. And this has really raised the stakes for actually doing things right. And so to help this, the French government published guidance on the mitigation hierarchy, also in 2012. This guidance explicitly states no net loss as its goal, which is interesting, and it details some things on offsets. And so what it says is that offsets have to be at least equivalent, and that a loss gain calculation has to be conducted. So setting area-based ratios isn't good enough anymore. It also requires that developers demonstrate that their offsets are feasible and timely. And so what the guidance actually says is that no irreversible damage must be done before offset measures are in place. But of course, exceptions can be made, if you demonstrate that doing it at a later stage doesn't prevent the overall outcome of ensuring no loss of conservation status. Then another important point is that offsets must be additional to existing or planned public policy targets. This is important, of course, but then it means that you're able to actually document existing or planned public policy targets, and this is very often harder than it sounds. And then the outcome of offset measures also has to be of sufficient duration, and that duration has to be proportional to that of impacts. And I guess this is also quite tricky sometimes because of the type of developers that are involved, who might be construction companies that only have short-term interests in their projects. But anyway, so this is the ambition of the guidance. but it's still very new. It dates only from 2012, and so there isn't a lot of feedback on actual implementation. So there's a lot of space for finding solutions to achieve these goals, and Biotope, as the leading biodiversity consultancy in France, is instrumental, I'd say, in developing and testing some of those innovative solutions to try and live up to the requirements or the ambition of that public policy. And what we bring to the discussion is 20 years of experience working with developers on the one side and also with the conservation community on the other side. And this gives us a unique position to help business and biodiversity sort of work together. And offsetting requirements actually provide a really good framework for this, and we find it very positive in that sense. So what we do is we work with developers, with regulators and the conservation community to develop methods, for example, for loss gain calculations, because until recently in France no one really did that. And also to trial new contract types and funding tools for actually implementing offsets. And one of those tools is banking. And so the French government has launched a pilot scheme to explore banking, and there are currently 5 banks being approved and trialed by the government as part of this scheme. They mainly target protected species because this is what is generating the offsets in France, as I mentioned. And Biotope is developing one of those bank projects for species that are associated with open Mediterranean habitats in southern France, so shrublands and grasslands in particular. And the government is actually closely involved in the process because it has to allow conservation gains to be recognized as possible offsets, even when those gains were obtained outside of the permitting process. And what I mean by that is that under French law, only the developer and the regulator are actually involved in the permitting. And anything that's done by a third party is outside of that process. And even more so if what was done prior to the permit application. And then another difficulty with developing banking in France is that liabilities cannot be transferred away from the permit holder, the developer in that case, to the banker. And we don't have easement mechanisms for protecting offsets in the long term, so we need to develop some new, more complex legal setups for this. Anyway, I'm not being really very positive about the prospects for banking, but things are really moving in the right direction, and we think this is very positive. So we're really happy to contribute in making sure that offsets are not only used as sort of a penalty system for developers, because we think if it went that way, it would just be a wasted opportunity.